Hi everybody, I hope you're doing well today. I am so excited to be back. I know it's been a long time since I've recorded anything or really done anything with my shop or on social media, and that's because at the beginning of the year, shortly after moving to Germany, I shattered my elbow in my dominant arm. That made art impossible to do for several months, and it was a very long recovery. But I would have to say it's probably one of the best things that's happened to me in my life because it really forced me to take a break. I was experiencing some serious burnout from teaching at the university and online, and I was honestly starting to not like making art, which I never thought would happen to me. So during that time of recovery, I was able to really refresh my understanding on art history, techniques, and really find my love for it again after feeling like a robot. I know that sounds horrible, but it happens to all of us when we are just overworked. And I'm sure you've experienced that in your own way. But I am so excited to be back here. With this design, I'm going to show you how to do these poppies, which are really fun for beginners. And these were the first paintings that I did after feeling more confident with my recovery. I was really struggling to still do detail work, which I'm getting better at, thankfully. And I'm just really excited to share these techniques. I know some of you have more experience with watercolor, and hopefully you'll learn something new today. One of the main things I wanted to do with this design was focus on color mixing, composition, and creating a really beautiful glow for the background of our design. So I'm just going to quickly go over the materials I'm using today, and then we'll get started. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is to prep our materials for painting. And what I like to use is hot press watercolor paper that I've cut down to two 5x7-inch sheets. And I prefer hot press watercolor paper just because it's a little bit smoother. But if you have cold pressed or rough texture watercolor paper, go ahead and test it out because you may find that you enjoy that texture of the paper and the results that come from your painting. So with this, I've just used regular masking tape and a clipboard just because it's cheap to hold my paper in place. And we're going to be using a lot of what's called wet and wet techniques where we're using a pre-dampened paper when we're painting just to move things around. And what happens is your paper, as it absorbs your water, it's going to expand and then contract. So there's going to be what's known as buckling that happens with your paper even after you've taken the tape off. And I'll have a video on how to correct that if you're, going to sell your painting or give it away as a gift or even just put it in a frame. And I like to have a 1/4-inch border around my paintings just because I think it's a really great way to frame your design. And it's also important because our watercolors have a type of transparency to them, which creates this really beautiful glow and vibrancy to our colors. And when we have just a little bit of the white of the paper shining through, not only on the border, but within our design, everything just comes to life. So that's something that you're going to learn as a process, just like keeping lighter areas of your painting just so things don't get too muddied. And I'll have a few suggestions while we're going through our designs. Another thing you'll notice, and I'll show this with paintings that I did in my local workshop. So these are still in process, but you'll notice like your paint in your tape is going to get pretty yucky. And all of that texture and even just the color of your tape is going to affect the way that you look at the colors in your design. And it can be very difficult to understand your values. For example, the yellow that's here in my background is very similar to the yellow of the tape. So there's two suggestions that I offer for this. And as you continue painting, you may not need to do this as you get more comfortable with your designs. But I like to keep some scraps of my watercolor paper around, and what I can do is just hover that over my design or while it's dry, just to see how these affect the way I'm seeing my colors. So for example, this yellow suddenly has a little bit more white added to it than if I take it away. So it's pretty incredible, just that little pop of white, what it does to our eyes when we're looking at our designs. Even these little tiny lighter areas of the stems look completely different when we take it away. At least to me, I don't know. Another thing that artists like to do is use what's known as artist tape. That's just white tape. This stuff is a little bit expensive. I don't use it that often anymore, but it's another way to just look at your colors correctly. So after you put down your regular masking tape, you can go back over it with your white. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and start mixing our colors. And I just have a version of our primary colors here. I have some cadmium yellow, cadmium red deep, ultramarine blue, and a little bit of sap green that is quite transparent. We'll use that to glaze over any murky colors that we have in our design, just in case things get a little too dark and we need to just brighten it up a little bit. So in the design, we have a variety of shades of green that I absolutely love. I love using blue green, green golds, yellow ochres. There's a challenge that you can have for yourself where you try and mix between 3 and 5 shades of green in your design. That way you just get a variety of color and just have fun with mixing your paints. So to do this, you'll want a variety of brushes too that we're going to use to start painting. I have a filbert brush here with the oval end to it. This is just to paint in our background. You can use a flat brush or a slightly larger brush, depending on the size of your paper. I have 2 versions of round brushes here, and then I have a rigger brush that is used to do these really tiny spindly stems for our design. So that one creates a nice fine point if we're trying to do some delicate work. So you'll also want a big cup of water that you'll probably need to change out while you're working, just so you always have clean water. And one of the things I like to start with is just by mixing my greens. So it's sometimes easier just to start taking some of your blue and putting a little bit of that in a few of your palettes or a few of your wells. So I'm just gonna use my big brush for that. You always wanna dip your brush in your water. And with these, we'll dilute it a little bit, especially on a hot day like today where we have our paints that want to dry out a little bit faster. So I'm just diluting some of this and scooping it into a few of these wells. And you'll notice I don't have a lot of paint on my palette. I don't really need it because I want to keep my colors transparent. Okay. So just a little bit so you can see that color. Mix a little bit more in there just since we're doing 2 designs today. After that, I'll just clean my brush off really well. And then we'll dip into some of our yellow. And you can just take a scoop of that and then press it along the side of each well. And this is just an easy base to start with. It's going to create several different shades of green based on how much yellow or blue is added together. So we'll start with this one, see, oh, that's a nice green. See how that looks. And I always like to use one of these scraps of paper just to test the color. So that's almost the color of my sap green right there. If I were to do a quick swatch of that. But you can see the sap green is just a little bit brighter out of the tube. A little bit of a reflection there. But hopefully you can see that difference. So for this is a great base, but we want it a little bit different from that sap green, else you're just kind of using the same color. So I'll just clean off my brush really quick, and I'm just going to take a tiny dip of red and mix that with this color. And since red and green are on other sides of the color wheel, they tend to neutralize each other a little bit. So you can get a slightly deeper color, a slightly more neutral color. And you can see just a little bit of red makes a huge difference right there. So if that's too murky for you, you can just go back into a little bit of your yellow, brighten that up a little bit. that's a nice medium right there. So either one of those colors will work for you, and you can see where this color pops up in the design quite a bit, especially along the bottom half here, where you're just getting that little bit of a murky green color, which I think is really beautiful. So on this next one, I want to have a slightly different shade of green, so I might just add a little bit more blue to this one, make it a little bit deeper. See how that one looks. It's a nice blue-green. Which is also similar to what we have on our design here. Now if you want to make it a little bit darker, again, you can just dip a tiny bit into your red paint. Oops, wrong one. Oh well. And that again is going to make it a little bit darker, make it a little bit of a richer color. Put a little bit more blue in there. Tiny bit more red. I don't want it neutralized too much, else it's going to make a brown. And those are all pretty good. Nice like Christmassy colors. But you can see this one's just slightly darker than the top one here. And that will help when we're making these really dark lines for parts of our stems and parts that are connecting to the petals and just other little foliage that we're mixing in. Clean my brush again. So on this one, I want to do something on the opposite spectrum. I want somewhere in between these two colors. So maybe more of a lighter green color here, or almost like a grass green. So I'm going to add a little bit more yellow to this one with my blue. And you can make so many different shades of green by just using this method. Again, that's close to that sap green color, so we're just going to add a tiny bit of red. And that might be perfect. Yep, that's a nice green. If you feel that's too close to this one, you can just go in with a little bit more yellow and a tiny bit more blue. So there's no real like perfect way to do this. You just want to have 3 distinct green colors or more if you're trying to add more colors to your design. Now the transparency will also change a lot of the way you're seeing these colors. So this was put on here a little bit heavier. If you wanted to dilute that a little bit, you can just get another little strip of paper. And if you just use a tiny bit less on your brush, you can always take a little bit off to the side of your well. And you can make that a transparent color. You can see that. Okay, so there's 2 other colors we'll mix really quick. The last 2 are this sky color here, and then this orange color that we're gonna mix later on. So for our sky color, what we'll do is we'll just use the center of the well here, and that way we can always mix another green from it after we're finished using it. So with this, we're going to take some of our blue, and we don't need a lot of this. Make sure your brush is a little bit wet to pull some of that color over. You just want enough to create a background for the top portion of our painting. So if we were to just take the ultramarine blue straight out of the tube, you get this really beautiful blue color. It's almost like a violet color with it. So I'm going to mix a tiny bit of red. It's going to make it slightly more like a lavender color out of it. Oops, you can't see that. Let me move that over. Take a little bit of our yellow, and that's going to neutralize it a little bit. So you're just going to bounce back and forth between those 3 colors until you find a nice balance. So it's going to be mostly blue with a little bit of red and a tiny bit of yellow. And you'll immediately know if you're using too much because it'll turn into a gray color. So I like kind of a stormy blue color at times, like this, if I want to have a little bit more drama to my design. Or if I wanted a little bit brighter like this one, I may just add a tiny bit of cerulean blue to it, or cobalt, just to brighten that up a little bit. Yeah, I think I'm gonna do that. Or maybe I won't need to, maybe just a little bit more ultramarine. I get picky with my colors, especially if I'm matching an example. I think in my original one I did have a tiny bit of cerulean blue with it. But all of these colors will work well with it, just to show you how that looked when you dilute it down. It does create this really beautiful color right here. So for this one, just to match a little bit more of the original design, I'm gonna go in with a little bit of my cerulean here. A little bit more. A little bit more water. Yeah, that's pretty. I like that. Tiny bit more yellow. Yeah, that'll work. Okay, so after that, I'm just gonna clean my brush one more time with mixing one more color, and we're gonna take a little bit of our red and a little bit of our yellow together. Just create a really beautiful rusty color if we wanna drop that into a few spots on our painting. So this will mostly be towards the bottom where you see just a little bit of that color popping throughout the bottom, just to keep the rest of it grounded and have some of this brighter color here showing somewhere towards the bottom. So that was red with a little bit of yellow. And that's a really beautiful color. Nice autumn color right there. Okay, we're gonna clean our brush one more time, and then this would be the perfect time to go ahead and grab some clean water. That way we can start with our background. Okay, so I went ahead and just started zooming in on the piece. And you can see in the original design, we have this swipe of this blue color across the top. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna leave a little bit of just regular water right here. And then towards the bottom, we'll start adding in a little bit of yellow to create that hazy glow that we're looking for. So to do this, we're going to have clearly our paper already ready to go. And you just want either a large, flat, or filbert brush. And we're going to use clean, fresh water. And we're going to just do these long brush strokes with our wet brush to dampen our paper. So this is known as the wet in wet technique, where we're pre-dampening our papers so we can create these really beautiful gradients. And we're also going to create some really beautiful blooms like this towards the background, where that color is just going to spread out. Okay, so we're going to dip our brush in our water, and you'll probably have to do this several times just to get the paper damp. And I like to do this at a slight angle on my table. If you lift the top part of your board, just so gravity is helping you a little bit with this. And the watercolor is only going to go where there is water on the paper. So if I were to stop along here where there's no water, it wouldn't go any further than that line. You can see there's a nice glossy part to our background, so we want to make sure that we cover the entire paper. You can always rotate the paper and see it at an angle to make sure that you're not missing any spots. I'm just going to do one more pass with this because it's very hot in my studio today. We don't want it soaked through too much, else the fibers of your paper start to break down. Normally I would use a slightly bigger brush for this, but this will work. Okay. So once that is nice and soaked through, you can wait a couple seconds. If it's a colder day, you can wait a little bit longer for some of this water to soak in. You just don't want there to be any big puddles of water sitting anywhere, because that's where your watercolor is going to pool up. So after that, I'm going to take a little bit of this blue on my brush. We're not looking for a lot. We can always add a little bit afterwards. And I'm just going to do just a little swipe of this color across the top. Now, if it's a little too light right here, I can always go in with a little bit more of my pigment. I'm going to stop right about there. If you want it even more dramatic, you can do like just a corner if you want. Sometimes people do this crisscrossing action to create this false sense of clouds. And after that, I'm just going to clean off my brush. I know this has a slight glare to it, but hopefully you can see that okay. And then once I clean off my brush, I'm just going to make sure that this bottom half here still has some clean water on it and it's not drying out too much. I know that we all paint at different speeds, so if you feel like it's a little too dry, go ahead and add just a little bit more water. And then from there, I'm going to dip into a little bit of my yellow paint. Just take a little bit of this up here. And we don't want it connecting directly to our blue right here, else it's going to create a green. So I'm going to start towards the bottom half, right about here, like about 3/4 of a way down, and slowly move my brush up to create just a little bit of a glow. And then you can create a little bit more drama towards the bottom if you want to have a little bit more of that yellow. Make sure your brush is still damp. And I like a nice soft glow with this. If you feel like you're creating a little band of color in a spot, you can just go over with a clean wet brush and you can just pass over those spots a little bit. Okay, just like that. So it's very subtle. You can almost not see it on the screen, but hopefully you can see it okay. And then from there, what we're gonna do is we're gonna switch to a slightly different brush. So I'm going to go in with my large round right here. Make sure that the brush is damp. And while this is still a little bit wet, I'm going to go ahead and dip into a little bit of my red right here. And you can take some of that up here on your palette. And then this is where I'm just going to drop some color into a few spots. So the top part of my sky is already drying out a little bit, so I'm just going to focus towards the bottom. And I'm just going to tap in a little bit of red here or there. Now, if your paper is already dry, I'll show you in a second how to reactivate your paper. But for right now, we're just tapping in a little bit of that color to create a really beautiful bloom. And here you can see where that pigment is just spreading out in spots. And you can just get some really soft petals. I'm not thinking too hard about where they're at. I can have some going off of the side of the paper, some towards the bottom. As many as you want to have, because as you can see, they're already starting to lighten quite a bit. And what I like to do is not have anything directly in the center of my design, just because that tends to create a little target. And you want whoever's looking at your design to really look around your entire piece, unless the whole purpose is to look directly at the center like a target. But I would just experiment with adding reds here or there. If you want to make something look a little bit darker, you can just tap a little bit more of that color in while it's still wet. But once it starts to really dry out, it's going to stick to like the top of the paper a little bit more and not move around the way that you might like. If that's the case, just let it completely dry. A little bit more towards the bottom here. Okay. And then some of these you can intentionally have more of like a 4-petal look to it, but you don't really need to because we're going to slowly build that color in. And I'll pretty much stop right there and let that completely dry. And then I'll show you how to add more wet and wet techniques after we reactivate our paper. So to do that, we want our paper to be bone dry. So if you need to, go ahead and use a hairdryer on a low setting and just pass over it for a few seconds until it doesn't have a gloss or anything on it, and then come right back. Okay, so now that this is completely bone dry, I can go ahead and start reactivating the background. So with some of this, hopefully it stays in place, so we're not trying to add too much water to it. We just want to have enough where we can start adding in some of these other details of our greens. So go ahead and make sure that your water is clean and a clean brush. And we're going to use that same original filbert brush here, and we're just gonna quickly just go over it. You don't want to use too much pressure on it because, like I said, it'll possibly reactivate the original painting, and if some of that happens, that's okay. We just don't want to disturb too much of it. I have to add a little bit more water than normal for mine just because it is so hot today. Definitely summertime. But I don't want to complain about it because I love it. Okay, get a nice gloss to your painting again. And this is where we're gonna go ahead and start adding in some of our green colors. And we're gonna do a very similar thing with our larger round brush again, the same one we used for our poppies. And I'm going to start tapping in a few of the colors. I like to start more with this muted greenish brown. So you may need to remix some of it with your brush in case some of it's separated on you. And from here, I'm just gonna add a few little drops of color. You can try and make them look like leaves if you're using the tip of the brush and just dragging it. Again, we're not looking for tons of details, so I'm kind of working in between some of the other colors that I already put down. And I'm leaving a little bit of space right here just for my main poppies. So if you want, you can draw a few petal or stem shapes. You can have some going off of the page a little bit. And you have to work kind of quickly because your paper definitely wants to dry. So once you add that, you can start with another one of your greens. So I'm going to go with this darker blue green in a few spots. Tapping that in mostly towards the bottom because that's where a lot of our darker shadows and shapes would be anyway. Again, not thinking too hard, just tapping some of these lines in. You can use the very tip of the brush if you want by just holding your brush vertically and just using a little bit of pressure. Go over a few more spots towards the top. And again, this is still going to dry a little bit light. And then I'm lastly going to use this other green that we have here. And you can do the same thing where we're creating these small little lines. A little bit more of this color towards the bottom. And then if you want to, you can use some of this orange that we mixed with our red and yellow. And I'm going to put that just in a few spots towards the bottom. And I can tell that a lot of my paint is already drying, so if you need to, you can just clean your brush really well, and then with a little bit of water from your brush, you can use that to move some of these paints around. A little bit more. I'm gonna add a little bit just of this yellow in a few spots. And we're still leaving some of the yellow of the background shining through. So we're just slowly building up layers. And as it dries, you're gonna have more distinct lines where they're not moving around. And that's good at this point where you just want a little bit of structure to your lines. So if you want to add a few stems going in different directions, or if you just want to add a little bit of foliage that's a little bit darker. And I love this part because you're really just going with your intuition and just adding bits of color here or there. And it creates that really effortless look, even though watercolor takes a lot of work. But it's just so much fun to see what happens. I like to do some of these little hook shapes throughout it, just because poppies tend to have a really heavy top to them, so their stems and flowers tend to droop a little bit, which creates a really specific look that's easy to recognize. And then definitely towards the bottom, I like to just go in with a little bit more of that darker color. If you need to, you can add a little bit of blue to it, just to create a slightly deeper color. You can see how that's going to create more of those lines. And again, I'm just pressing that down in a few spots to create those textures. You can wiggle your brush a little bit too if you want to create some stems that don't look perfect, or a little foliage here or there. I always think that looks really pretty. Or you can tap on just a few spots. You can see we're quickly developing our design. Use a little bit more of this color. And after that, I'm just going to add a few little pod shapes. So this looks like a little bell or goblet looking shape right here. And that's a little dark, so I'm just going to scoop off a tiny bit of that color. I'm going to go in with a slightly lighter color to drop in there. And then what I like to do is the tip of the brush, I'll just tap on with the tip of the brush to create a little crown for the little poppy. I also like to use broken lines too. Do one more of those right over here. Now if you need to, you can use a smaller brush for this. To go in with, you can even use a little bit of just solid yellow in spots if you want to make that shape. You can have some that are a little bit wider. Some poppies have more of like a wide shape like that. And if it looks too dark, just use your brush and scoop up some of that color and just wipe it off on your paper towel. Just going to tap on a little crown with just the tip of the brush. And I might go in with just a slightly darker color in a few spots, especially where it meets the base of that stem. Maybe right along parts of the top. So as that dries, it's going to create several different greens within it, and it just looks really beautiful. Same over here, if I feel like that's too dark while it's drying, I can just scoop a little bit of that up. You can also have ones that just look like little leaf shapes throughout it. And eventually your design is going to start having almost like a velvet texture to it. And that's the perfect opportunity to go in with a smaller brush and start lifting some of this color towards the bottom out of it. So I'm going to use this rigger brush where it's just this long skinny handle, or you can use a small round. We're going to dip that in our water. And what happens is, because our paper has soaked up so much of the water, there's only so much more it could add, and then it starts repelling it. So if I just use some light brush strokes with water, it's going to create some really beautiful negative shapes. So you want to just keep dipping your brush in your water, and you'll see it starting to repel in spots. And that creates what's known as a backwash. And I love to do this for my designs because as it dries, it just turns into something completely different. It's gorgeous. So you don't need too much of this, just wherever you want to have a little bit of a backwash. Right here, you can see how that's really starting to come forward. And again, it's all about making it look effortless. So if you really want to make that pop, you can just wipe off any of the pigment that comes off on your brush onto your paper towel. And right here you can see like blooming that's happening, where it's the opposite, where it's starting to repel areas. And that's just a perfect little form of texture that I love to use for my designs. So we have some background shapes, we have some very blurred distant shapes where you can still see it's part of the design, some blurred floral and foliage shapes here, and then as we get towards the front, we're going to start building more distinct lines and shapes like these seeds. Now some of my design is looking a little bit too like pink in areas, so to make sure that I have a little bit more of that red poppy color, I'm just going to go in with a little bit more of my solid red, and while some areas are drying, I'm just going to drop that color into a few spots. And then if there's some areas that are a little bit more dry, you can intentionally create some shapes that look like poppies that are partially opening, or ones going off of the page a little bit. We're just keeping it nice and loose. Just gonna drop a few little colors here or there. Just gonna use a little bit more water on my brush. I'm not really in love with this spot right here, so I'm just gonna scoop some of that up a little bit. And then I can go in with a slightly darker green in a few spots if I just want to add that around it to create a little bit more of a center of my poppy. I can always add some red to it after that. And that just makes it look a little bit more grounded. Okay, after that I'm just going to clean my brush off really well again. And this is where we're going to start adding in some other little shapes for our design. Now you'll notice that right here are the darkest areas of our poppies. So if we simplify that down, we can start to think about the major shapes. So I have a little trick for this. We're going to dip directly into our red paint with the same large brush. Now if you're doing smaller poppies, you can always use your smaller round. But from here, I want to make sure that it's loaded up with paint. And I'm going to create this shape right here to start with. Almost like a little leaf shape. And then I'm going to have another one coming from the side. Just like a slightly thinner one. And then one right along here. And these can all connect like that. I'll do another one down here. This one I'll probably just do 2 of those little petal shapes to start with. And I'll do one more right along here. So we're getting the darkest part of our petals in. And then I have a little trick that I like to do just to make them look more transparent. You can see that. Okay, I'll lift that up a little bit. And we're going to let that dry down. Because what we're going to do is after this dries down a little bit, we're going to use a clean wet brush and start connecting the rest of these petal shapes. And while that's drying, we can go in with our darker blue, that really dark bluish black. And this is where we can start connecting some of these stems, anywhere where you want to add any sort of little details to it. So you can use the reference photo as part of an image, but you'll see there's a lot of broken little lines and spots. And that's just to keep that looseness to our design. So I don't want you to get too tight with your painting. This is just really a gestural design, and that's because our brains are so smart. They know what we're looking at. We know that we're seeing flowers, we're seeing poppies in a field, and we don't need very much information for us to understand what we're looking at. So I'm just mixing up a little bit more of this color. So I have this nice blue-green, this deep green right here. And while this is still a little bit wet, you can use your small brush, that tall, skinny brush, if you have that. Oops, my blue just got mixed up. Okay, so I'm just going to add some of these thin stems in areas, anywhere where I want some of that going through there. Don't be afraid to let some of them cross over each other. And again, I'm using this really thin, skinny brush and just going directly over it, just using the point of the brush to create my designs. And then anywhere where it's going to hit this red, it's going to blend a little bit into that original color. And just keep loading up your brush. You can have some kind of poking through the background, some coming through the front of your design. And you're going to have a natural shake to your hands, which makes it really nice for when you're starting to do this really delicate painting. So in nature, there's always these irregular lines and organic lines that aren't perfectly straight. So just let yourself just kind of go with the flow with it. I'm just adding slightly darker areas to create deeper values to my design. Letting things cross over each other. I add a little bit more green to the center of this poppy right here because it still feels a little off. There's always like one part of my painting where I'm like, dang it. But that's part of it. Part of the process. Usually by the end I'm okay with it, but you know, you're in this like in-between point where you're like, I'm not quite sure if I like this, what is going on? And that's okay. That's totally normal. I'm gonna go in with just a few more little deep lines right here. I'm just gonna tap on some shapes that kind of look like leaves and spots. You can wiggle your hand a little bit to create some of these more irregular leaves that are typically seen with poppies. And again, towards the bottom, we want to have some of this to be a little bit darker. So this is where you can go in between some of these lines just to deepen them up. And I'm going to switch brushes just because I want to have some variety of lines here. And I'm also going to switch my paint color to one of my other greens. I'm just kind of letting myself tap on some of these shapes and spots. So you can drag the color in a few areas if you feel like there's too many of these thin lines. Go ahead and just blend that out a little bit with your brush. Create some really beautiful textures towards the bottom. You can just keep it loose. I know it's harder to do that, especially with watercolor where you feel like everything has to be really precise. But the more you just let it do its thing, especially with drying, the more little happy surprises you get out of it. Again, still not loving this thing right here, so I'm gonna see if I can pull up some of the color or maybe add some yellow in spots or that rusty color. It needs like a little bit of change. It just looks like a red blob right now. If I pull up that color a little bit, or fade that color a little bit, see how there's this heavy line right here? I'm just gonna use a little bit of water on my brush just to dilute that a little bit and push that more towards the backgrounds. That already looks better to me. Yeah, that's what it needed. It was too, it was too weird. I'm picky, but yeah, that feels a little bit more planted with the rest of this, especially when I start moving these around. So after this, we're gonna switch to a clean brush. This is our medium round. It's the number 6. And this is mostly dry here. So what I'm gonna do with this brush is just push a little bit of this color from this side over to the other side. And I like to just wiggle my hand a little bit. It's gonna reactivate that color. To try and create more of that poppy shape. You can always, like if it starts to look a little too perfect, you can just press down a little bit and scoop up some of that color. And that's going to create a really beautiful transparency to our petals, especially since poppies are very delicate looking, even though they're resilient. We're going to do the same thing over here. Use a little bit of water and a clean brush. And it's okay if you lose some of that original line work with those shapes. I'll show you how to get that back. Same thing over here. And we're not putting a lot of pressure on our paper. We're not trying to accidentally scumble the paper too much where you're pulling up fibers and creating a little divot. And create one more little petal right here. This looks a little strange. There we go. And if anything looks a little off, just scoop it up and you can wipe off the excess on your paper towel. I like that kind of fluid look between the two. Now, if you need to add some of your red, just go back in with a little bit of red on your brush. Especially towards the bottom, I just like to add a little bit more of that pigment. It doesn't have to be a perfect shape, but it just helps to give some structure to your poppy. Especially on this one down here. This one looks like it lost a little bit of that original color. And that's looking really nice. You can even do that with some of these over here if they just look a little odd. Go ahead and clean your brush off and have a little bit of fresh water on it, and you can just diffuse that a little bit. Just to make it look more like it's just floating into the back of the design where it's dissolving. I always think that looks really pretty. Adding a little bit more red in spots. And then what I like to do is clean off my brush, and from here I'm going to add just a tiny bit of yellow to my brush. And where we have some of these petals, you can leave it like this where it's almost like a pink petal, but I want it to be a little bit more dramatic. So I'm going to do a little glaze of yellow just over a few spots just to give it some warmth. And see how that just adds a little bit of drama to it. It also ties some of these other colors in with your design. So you don't need a lot of this, you can just pick and choose where you want some of that color to show up. Even down here you can add just a little pop of yellow in some spots. And I just think that really brings that to life. Now some of this looks a little flat here too. This is where I also go in with a little glaze of yellow, just to warm that up a little bit. Or you can do the opposite if you want to add a little bit more of that bluish green. I'll show you that really quick. Add some of that within your design if you want, just to give it a little bit more structure. If it looks like it's just sitting, like right here, where it's not moving around, just add a little bit of water to your brush, and you can just blend that into the rest of that little shape. Same here. It's a really easy way to create dimension and volume within some of these shapes. I'm gonna go a little bit more yellow just in a few spots on this one poppy. Just to show you how it's really fun, just create some warmth again. And then if you need to add any more yellow to the bottom, you can do that in some spots if you feel like it's a little bit too murky. Or you can go in with your sap green color that we haven't used yet. And you can do the same kind of thing with the glaze. So let's say like right around here, if I want to warm up a spot with a little bit of that green. I feel like I don't need too much of it in this one, but it's always fun to just experiment with. Add a little bit of color in spots where you feel like you need them. And if it looks a little off, you can just blend it out with a little bit of paint. Okay. So after that, you can just wait for it to dry, and just in comparison, you can kind of see how these, let me zoom this out. You can see how these look next to each other. So pretty close, not too bad. You can always scoop up if you don't like some of the colors. You can do the same thing that you did with parts of your poppy. If you feel like something's too dark, you just go back in and pull some of that color up. And that will help separate some of these shapes if you need it. Actually, I think that helped a lot. Okay, so I hope you like the class. I would love to see how your designs turned out, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.